when the title daylight, be bright. Good evening, everybody. It's 7 o'clock, so we're going to start promptly. And welcome to our fourth Hosmer Williams lecture. Tonight, we're happy to have Erik Alexander, Dr. Erik Alexander, history professor at SIUE. He's very well articulate about the Lincoln-Douglas debate. He's done that for PBS, so we're very fortunate to have someone who can really explain all of that era to us, the 1800s, and that's kind of his specialty. So without further ado, we're going to welcome Dr. Erik Alexander.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for having me tonight. As Donna said, I'm Erik Alexander. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History at SIUE. I've been there since 2013. I teach courses on the 19th century United States, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Abraham Lincoln. I'm very happy to be speaking tonight, though, because since the beginning of this year, this calendar year, I've been serving in an administrative position as the interim chairperson of the social work department. And just to be clear, I am not a social worker. I don't know the first thing about social work. I've sort of been thrown into this because I answered the phone one day and they're the person who asked me to do it. But I only mention that because it means I've been spending a lot of time sending emails and writing reports instead of actually doing the thing I like to do, which is to talk history, and especially talk history with other curious-minded and intelligent people who are interested in learning more about the past. So I'm teaching less right now, and so it's very nice and refreshing to be able to do the thing I really enjoy doing. Along with teaching, I am a professional historian, and my scholarly research focuses on American political history. So I've published articles and book chapters on a wide range of topics covering Civil War era politics. I'm personally and particularly interested in the history of political parties in the United States, the relationship between both political and social change. And so I think the topic for tonight that I was asked to speak on is a perfect place to think about those ideas, the political change, political parties, social change. And of course, tonight we'll be talking about a very famous series of 7 debates between Abraham Lincoln, and stopped working again. There we go. A very famous series, 7 debates between Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, that took place in 1858, and particularly the debate that happened just down the road in Alton, which was the 7th and final debate. So I imagine everyone here has heard of the debates, even if you've just vaguely remembered the name, know that there's some sort of debate between Lincoln and Douglas. This is a photo from the memorial in Charleston, Illinois, which I was at earlier this fall. Given our proximity here to both Jacksonville as well as the Springfield area, I'm sure many of you have at least heard of Stephen A. Douglas. That's me. I took a selfie with Mr. Douglas this past fall. I was happy to do so because he was 5'4", I'm 5'6", so it's rare I'm taller than somebody. So that was me with Mr. Douglas, who actually looked kind of happy to see me. And then, of course, we've all heard of Abraham Lincoln. There's no doubt about that. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to tell you a little bit more about the debates themselves, particularly the debate in Alton. And again, as I said, that was the 7th and final debate of these series. But to really properly understand the debates, their importance at the time, their larger significance in American history, I want to try to situate them within the very complicated decade of the 1850s, which was, I think, one of, if not the most tumultuous and polarizing moments in American history, and a moment that, to me personally, speaks to us more and more, just given how polarized things are today, regardless of whatever your political beliefs or affiliations are. I think we can all agree that things have become so much more polarized, and in that sense, it becomes easier to see or maybe understand or at least empathize with what Americans were going through in the 1850s. So to be clear, we will get to the debates themselves, what happened, what was said, why these two politicians were debating in the first place, but bear with me as I rewind a little bit, and I'm going to provide a little background to try to help us understand what was going on in the United States in the 1850s and why these debates became such a big deal. So let's set the stage a little bit. The 1850s, again, one of the most important and complex decades in American history, because what we're really talking about here when we're talking about the 1850s, when we're talking about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, we're really talking about the events that led to the American Civil War. Lincoln, of course, famous, our 16th president. We live in the land of Lincoln. We don't live in the land of Douglas. There's very good reasons for that. And we live in the land of Lincoln because of Lincoln's role as the president who led the United States through the most transformative and destructive moment in American history. It's a 4-year conflict. It resulted in the deaths of 750,000 Americans. That's more Americans than if you take every other war the United States has fought, it's more Americans killed in every other war combined. If you take that as a percentage of the overall population, it comes out to roughly about 10 million Americans today, meaning if we were to fight in a conflict today where an equivalent percentage of the population were to die, there'd be about 10 million people. So try to wrap our minds around that. I can remember during the Iraq War of the early 2000s when we hit, I think, 2,500 soldiers had been killed, and the New York Times ran on their front page the name of every soldier that had died, and Americans lost their minds. So that's 2,500 people. During the Civil War, that's the equivalent of maybe an hour of combat. This was also the single most transformative moment in American history because it resulted in the end of slavery, emancipation, and freedom for 4 million enslaved men and women. And Lincoln, rightly or wrongly, is widely known and celebrated for these reasons. He's the president who preserved the Union. He was the great emancipator who freed the slaves. But just a few years earlier, in 1858, Lincoln was not the president, and he was not famous. He was certainly not widely known outside of the state of Illinois, and he was barely known within Illinois outside of Springfield. He had spent his career largely as a lawyer, a very successful lawyer, a very wealthy lawyer. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to the Lincoln home in Springfield. By the standards of the day, that's a McMansion. I mean, he was a very successful, effectively a corporate railroad lawyer. But in 1858, the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, his career as a politician had been pretty unremarkable. He had served a few terms in the 1830s as a representative in the state legislature. In the 1840s, he served one term as a congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives. He had been a very loyal and proud member of the Whig Party, that's Whig, W-H-I-G. He spent lots of time as a political operative, giving speeches, stumping around the state for presidential candidates like Henry Clay, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor. But in 1858, he really wasn't that well known. Ironically, it was Stephen A. Douglas, was by far, at the time, the more famous of these two men. Douglas was not only better known than Lincoln, he was arguably the most famous politician in the United States. He was, at this moment, one of the two sitting senators from Illinois. He had been in the United States Senate since 1847. Prior to that, he had served two terms as a congressman. He had been a justice on the Illinois State Supreme Court and had also started his career as the Illinois Secretary of State. He had truly had a meteoric rise through the ranks of the Democratic Party, starting at the state level and then rising all the way to the Senate. By 1858, Douglas, when he debated Lincoln, he was already widely known as the Little Giant, famous, again, as I mentioned, for his small stature at just 5'4", but he was known for this thundering and powerful oratory. By 1858, he was a major mover and shaker in the National Democratic Party. And as we'll discuss here in just a little bit, he was behind several major pieces of federal legislation, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And in 1858, he was up for re-election to the Senate, and he was the odds-on favorite to receive the Democratic Party's presidential nomination in 1860. So by the time Lincoln and Douglas were debating in 1858, it was Douglas who was famous, not Lincoln. And it was Lincoln who was still trying to make a name for himself nationally. And this is one of the reasons the Lincoln-Douglas debates remain so important, and I'll talk about this evening. It was because of Lincoln's participation in these debates that launched him to a national career. It was because of his participation in these debates that paved the way for him to receive the presidential nomination of the Republican Party in 1860. In other words, if there are no Lincoln-Douglas debates, there would likely be no President Lincoln. And of course, if there's no President Lincoln, American history looks dramatically different. No President Lincoln, there's a very real possibility after the election of 1860, there would have been no secession by South Carolina and 6 other southern states. If you have no secession, there's no Civil War. If there's no Civil War, there's no emancipation. Or maybe everything turns out exactly the same, who knows? But the point being that these debates launched Lincoln into national fame, and they set into motion the events that would lead Lincoln to the presidency. So those were the two men involved, which I'm sure we've all heard of on some level, but to really understand these debates, why they gained so much attention, we have to understand what was at stake. First, the idea of two candidates debating in the fashion that Lincoln and Douglas did was actually pretty unusual for the day. Today, we're very accustomed to political debates. I'm sure everyone here at some point in their life has watched presidential debates, and during a presidential election, I'm sure we can all think of and point in our lifetime to modern examples of presidential debates that shaped the outcome of an election. Debates today are very important. It's a very integral part of our political and electoral process. At this time, however, this was actually pretty unusual. It was unusual for two candidates to travel around together and engage in rhetorical combat on the most important issues of the day. And then when you add in the fact that one of the two candidates was arguably the most famous politician in the entire country, it adds even more to the spectacle and the uniqueness of these debates at the time. Stump speeches were very common. This was a very tried and true practice of American politics. Both of these men were were expert stump speakers. This was the 19th century, the 1800s in the United States. There was not a lot to do. There's no television. There's no electricity. There's no phones. There's no movies. There's no social media. There's no internet. Listening to a politician give a speech for several hours, and that's normally how long these speeches went, that's a form of entertainment. In fact, what we're doing tonight is part of a very age-old American tradition. And in fact, in a space, I was talking before we began, in a space just like this, dating back to the 1850s, people would have come from the community to hear lecturers, to hear politicians, to hear speeches, to hear religious sermons. This is one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the 19th century. Pardon me. But two politicians engaging with each other on the most important issues of the day, that was not common. And then when you add in some of the new technologies that were emerging at the time, new technologies that had revolutionized American society, the railroad for one, the telegraph for the other, that made these debates an even larger spectacle. Beginning in the 1840s and into the 1850s, you had seen the expansion of railroad networks around the United States, expanding like spiderwebs, but especially in the North, as the North began to industrialize, as the North began to urbanize. And here what this map shows us is around the time of the Civil War, the various railroad networks, you can see sort of how divergent the North and South have become, where the North has become more interconnected, it's become more urbanized, more industrialized, while the South has remained overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. This made it possible, these railroad networks, particularly in Illinois, where Chicago became the central hub in the West of railroads, this made it possible for large numbers of spectators to travel around the state of Illinois and see the debates. And Alton, of course, was a major railroad hub, as it is today still. And so people could come in from all over the state, all over the country, in fact, to attend these debates. Meanwhile, the expansion of telegraph wires around the country, connected information networks. The telegraph invented in 1844. This made it possible for news to spread literally overnight. Before the invention of the telegraph, news spread as quickly as it could be carried effectively manually. Normally by carriage, by horseback, later by railroad, but it might take up to 3 weeks. 3 weeks for something that happened, say, in New York City to travel and reach Chicago or St. Louis or all the way to the South. You can, in fact, track this. If you look at, we have newspaper databases now, and you can track articles spreading across the country. Something happens in New York, you can see it in Philadelphia within a day or two. You can see it move into Cincinnati and then Louisville and then St. Louis. You can track it through the newspapers. It took 2 to 3 weeks for news to spread. But with the telegraph, this electronic device that could transmit things instantaneously via Morse code, news and reports of Lincoln and Douglas's speeches could be immediately transmitted around the country. So interested spectators, political junkies, people following the news could immediately learn about what Lincoln and Douglas had said, whether they were in New York City or Philadelphia or Charleston, South Carolina or Boston. They could open their newspapers literally the next day and read transcripts of what Lincoln and Douglas had said the day before. So when you put all that together, the fact that these debates are unusual, the fact that it's Douglas, one of the most famous politicians of the day, the railroads, the telegraphs, all of that created a sort of perfect storm for a major cultural event that captured the nation's attention. And then you have the fact that they were talking about what were the most important and divisive issues of the day. And let's be clear, the issues they were debating were just as important as the men who were debating them. So what were they debating? Well, it was the issues that made the 1850s the most chaotic and tumultuous decade in American history. It was the very same issues that drove the sectional conflict that eventually led to the nation splitting into two in a civil war that killed 750,000 people and freed 4 million more. And all of these issues stemmed from one basic conflict, and that was, of course, the conflict surrounding the institution of African American slavery. But to be clear, Lincoln and Douglas were not debating the existence of slavery. At this point in his political career, frankly, at no point in his political career until the very end, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. For as much as we associate Lincoln as the great emancipator, as the president who oversaw and freed the slaves, he came to that position very, very late in his life. And Douglas by no means was an abolitionist, was in fact quite the opposite. Rather, what Lincoln and Douglas were debating was the issue of slavery extension. Should the institution of slavery be allowed to expand into the West, which Lincoln was steadfastly against? And let me be clear that Lincoln personally always throughout his entire life, every shred of evidence we have says he believed slavery was morally wrong. There is no doubt about that. However, the question of was the federal government allowed to end slavery was a different legal question altogether. And it wasn't until late in his life that he came to that idea that emancipation was a possibility. However, federal territories, that's very different. There's an important difference between states and territories. Territories are controlled by the federal government, and Lincoln and other Republicans believed that the federal government had the authority to prevent the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And as we'll talk about here in a moment, that is the issue. Slavery expansion into the West, that is the issue that had completely turned American politics upside down. It had completely destroyed the political parties, the political system, and is the issue that put the nation on the brink of war. So, to fully understand these issues, to fully understand the positions that Lincoln and Douglas were taking during their debates, I'd like to spend the next 20 minutes or so explaining exactly what had happened leading up to these debates, and then we can talk about the debates themselves. The debates took place in 1858, and to fully really understand the context, we've got to rewind just about 10 years, go all the way back to the 1840s. As you may know, the United States fought a war with Mexico between 1846 and 1848. I won't go into the details of that to say why it was fought, other than the fact that it was started by the president at the time, James K. Polk, the only president with a mullet, for whatever that's worth. And it was largely based on falsified information that Polk gave to Congress to persuade Congress to declare war, back when we actually let Congress do stuff. And he did so with the full intention of seizing Western lands, particularly California. And we know all this both from Polk's diaries, we know his intentions from his diaries, as well as other government records. For our purposes, the important thing to emphasize here is the outcome of that war with Mexico. As part of the treaty with Mexico, the United States gained, acquired, seized, if you want to say, an enormous amount of land. That land became known as the Mexican Cession. Effectively all of modern-day California, Nevada, and Utah, parts of Wyoming, Arizona, and New Mexico. And then once this land became part of the United States in 1848, the immediate question was what to do with it. And especially the question, what are we going to do about slavery in that land? Would American slaveholders be allowed to take their human property into Western territories now controlled by the federal government? And the answer was unclear. Going all the way back to the Constitution, in 1787, the Constitution had provided a process by which states could join the Union. but had not allowed or made clear what the status of slavery would be in those lands. At the time of the nation's founding, the ratification of the Constitution, the United States controlled all of the land west to the Mississippi. In 1785, before the Constitution, there was a law put in place called the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. That law had placed the boundary of slavery at the Ohio River. So territory north of the Ohio River, slavery was prohibited. This is why Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, eventually Michigan and Wisconsin, this is why all of these territories eventually became free states. But of course, nobody in 1787 had any idea that eventually the United States would stretch all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and there were no laws accounting for the possibility of slavery west of the Mississippi River. And that became an issue following the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and then the eventual application of Missouri to become a slave state in 1819. Missouri was the first state west of the Mississippi River to apply for statehood, and they did so as a slave state. Northerners and Southerners argued about this in Congress. Northerners were opposed and said Missouri should not be allowed to join the nation as a slave state. It would set a precedent. Southerners said, no, the federal government has no authority to prohibit slaveholders from taking their property wherever they want to go. The eventual solution, which became known as the Missouri Compromise, added Missouri as a slave state. The state of Maine, which had to that point been part of Massachusetts, Maine was added as a free state, and most important, the southern border of Missouri, the 3630 parallel, the 3630 line, that became the future boundary of slavery. And as a piece of trivia, if you take that line and you stretch it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, you end up on the 18th green of Pebble Beach Golf Course. That doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. I just think it's interesting. But the Missouri Compromise had set this boundary through the Louisiana Purchase, which more or less stretches to the Rocky Mountains. The problem is that the addition of the Mexican Cession reopens this entire question. And there were lots and lots of questions. Would slavery be allowed to expand into the West? What about the boundaries of Texas? At this point, Texas had become part of the United States. Texas, as you may know, gained its independence in 1836. They spent almost 10 years, and it's an independent republic, an independent nation, before joining the United States in 1845. That was actually part of the reason we fought a war with Mexico, diplomatic reasons. This is what Texas looked like at the time. Everybody knows the shape of Texas. I imagine you can even try to draw it. You've seen belt buckles. That's not what Texas looks like now. It looks like Texas with some sort of abnormal growth on the side of it. So the question was, would Texas be allowed to keep all this territory? Would its boundary change? You had the fact that in 1849, there was a gold rush in California, just outside of San Francisco. If you're a football fan, that's why the NFL team is the San Francisco 49ers, named after the gold rush of 1849. That gold rush sent enough people to California looking to make a fortune to give California the number of people it needed to apply for statehood. They wanted to apply as a free state. Would that be allowed? That was an open question. There were other questions. What about slavery in the nation's capital? Northerners were increasingly disgusted and embarrassed with the presence of slavery, and especially men and women being bought and sold within eyesight of the American Capitol building. Northerners wanted slavery abolished altogether in the nation's capital. On the other hand, Southerners wanted a newer, harsher fugitive slave law that addressed the issue of enslaved people running away. Southerners argued that Northerners were not upholding their end of the bargain, which in the original Constitution required the return of runaway slaves. These were all open-ended questions around 1850, and the answer to these questions was a very famous law known as the Compromise of 1850. That law took 9 months to pass, but it answered all of these questions by adding California as a free state to the Union. It gave Texas its modern shape, settling that boundary issue in favor of New Mexico territory. In return for giving up a lot of land, Texas had some of its debt paid off by the federal government that Texas had accumulated during its independent republic period. The slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C. No longer could human beings be bought and sold in the nation's capital, though Southern politicians could still bring their slaves to Washington. And then, in return, Congress passed and adopted a much harsher fugitive slave law. This compromise had been proposed by Henry Clay, very well known as the Great Compromiser. He then had to leave the nation's capital because he became ill over the summer. Then, on July 4th, President Zachary Taylor, who was the hero of the Mexican-American War, died while eating a bowl of ice cream and cherries. His replacement, Millard Fillmore, one of our many forgettable presidents, Fillmore helped push that legislation through, along with none other than Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas took Clay's proposal, which was originally proposed as one big omnibus bill, broke it up into smaller pieces, passed each part individually. On the question of slavery in the West, California was added as a free state, while the rest of that territory was decided under the principle of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, literally meaning the people rule. This was the idea that rather than determining whether or not slavery would be abolished or allowed, prohibited or permitted in the territory, they would simply leave it open and let the future settlers of those territories decide for themselves. This was the principle that Douglas had staked his entire political career on, the idea of popular sovereignty. Let settlers decide for themselves. Let the people rule. People can determine for themselves whether or not slavery should be allowed in the West. The result was that by 1850, it almost appears as if all of the sectional questions have been answered. All of the territory has been accounted for. The United States looks quite a bit like it does today. And Stephen A. Douglas's name, his reputation, skyrocketed to fame as a result. As being one of the principal architects of this compromise, he took on a new level of fame and importance. But by 1854, Douglas had a new problem. Douglas was very interested in developing a transcontinental railroad. He wanted that railroad to have its point of origin in Chicago, which, as an aside, Douglas owned a lot of land that he would sell to the railroad companies and make a small fortune for himself. He wanted that railroad to run from Chicago, all the way to California. The problem was that under the Compromise of 1850, that railroad would have to pass through unorganized territory. But you have to have governments in place to do things. You needed to have governments to regulate the construction of the railroads. And so Douglas knew if this railroad was going to be built, you'd have to organize that territory. Well, how do you organize territory? It has to go through Congress. Because of the Louisiana Purchase and the Missouri Compromise we talked about a few minutes ago, slavery was prohibited in all of that unorganized territory. And the problem Douglas faced was there was no way he could organize that territory. There's no way he could propose a bill that would organize that territory and have the support of Southern senators as long as slavery was still prohibited. That was the problem he faced. So the solution for Douglas was to argue, with the support of President Franklin Pierce, that the Compromise of 1850 had actually overturned the old Missouri Compromise. And now what that meant, Douglas argued, was that slavery was now open, those territories were now open to the possibility of slavery. The result was two new territories, Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory, and they would be organized by popular sovereignty, just like the other territories in the West. Again, popular sovereignty. This is the principle, the idea that Douglas staked his entire political career on. Well, as you can imagine, when you see the difference, you go from a large chunk of land where slavery is outlawed to now the possibility of slavery in this huge amount of territory. This was an enormously unpopular law in the North, what became known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law, which Douglas was responsible for, it was Douglas's brainchild. He was the one who did all of the work to push it through Congress. Douglas was the one who went to the president, Franklin Pierce, and got his support for the law. Douglas took the blame. It led to the disintegration of the old Whig Party, Abraham Lincoln's original political home. Whigs in the North, who had largely been anti-slavery, could not vote for this law because they could not support a law that allowed for the expansion of slavery. But Southern Whigs couldn't vote against it, because if they voted against it, they would be seen as soft on slavery by Southern voters, and they would be outflanked by pro-slavery Democrats. The irony here is that Douglas was trying to avoid angering Southerners But by repealing the Missouri Compromise and opening up these territories to the possibility of slavery, this actually infuriated white Northerners. And it is hard to overstate just how angry Northerners were. There's a very famous story where Douglas, after the congressional session ended, after this law had been passed, Douglas was traveling back to Chicago, and he wrote to a friend in a letter, quote, "I could travel from Boston to Chicago by the light of my own effigy." An effigy being, of course, a likeness hung. It was a very common form of political protest. You would create a straw dummy of somebody, hang it from a tree, and set it on fire. As Douglas traveled back to Chicago, he said, "All along the Western Reserve of Ohio, I could find my effigy upon every tree we passed." He almost immediately realized he had made a terrible mistake in pushing this law through Congress. There's another wonderful anecdote that once Douglas arrived back in Chicago, this is in August of 1854, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act had passed, Douglas arrived and he announced in the newspapers he would be giving a speech on Saturday, September 2nd. And according to one report, when Douglas showed up to give his speech, he, quote, "had uttered but few words when a storm of hisses and groans mingled with shouts and cheers drowned out his voice. Douglas stood his ground, declaring that he would remain until he was heard. Whereupon the raucous voices of his adversaries rose in the song, 'We won't go home till morning, till morning, till morning. We won't go home till morning, till daylight doth appear.' Against all of the chaos, Douglas shouted his attack on the press and responded to the citizens of Chicago. Until nearly midnight, Douglas boldly and insistently defended his position before an unruly crowd alleged to be armed and bent on violence. Out of patience at last, Douglas hurled his final words at his hecklers. 'Abolitionists of Chicago,' he said, 'it is now Sunday morning. I shall go to church and you may go to hell.'" The point there is that this is how angry Northerners were. As I mentioned, in the aftermath of this Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party, a national party which elected two different presidents, completely disintegrated, and it was replaced by a brand new party, the Republican Party, the first truly sectional party in American history, the new political home of Abraham Lincoln. And I just want to pause and ask everyone to think about this. This is in the course of one presidential election. Imagine an entire political party just vanishing. Pick either political party, whichever one you hate the most. I think at this point we all hate them both equally, but pick whichever one you dislike and imagine it vanishing. It's unthinkable to see a major political party vanish in the course of one presidential election to be replaced on this map by the red, which is the new Republican Party. On this map of 1852, we've got blue as the Democrats, yellow as the Whigs. By 1856, the Whigs are gone, and they're replaced only in the North by the Republicans. The Republican Party, a truly sectional party. In many places in the North, it began as a, quote, anti-Nebraska party, meaning it was being organized in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But by 1856, it had formally organized into a national party. They ran a candidate, a man named John C. Fremont, a military hero. Fremont lost to the Democratic nominee, James Buchanan, who, by the way, I've always said, looks like if a baby was born and was 70 years old, that's what James Buchanan would look like, just a 70-year-old baby. I don't like Buchanan very much. And the reason I don't like Buchanan is because several events during his administration, which is one of the worst in American history, would make this growing crisis even worse and would put Douglas in an even more difficult position as we get to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. First, opening up Kansas to the possibility of slavery, which is what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did. This led to effectively a shooting war on the ground in Kansas that became known as Bleeding Kansas. The irony here is that there is very little evidence that slaveholders wanted to go to Kansas. When the Census Bureau conducted its census of Kansas in 1860, they found a grand total of two slaves in the entire territory, meaning that virtually no slaveholders went to Kansas. But that wasn't really the issue. The issue here is actually about power. It's about the political map. We back up just briefly and think about all of this new territory. as slaveholders looked at this vast amount of territory in the West, or even if we look at one of these election maps, as they looked at all of that gray territory that was yet to be accounted for, slaveholders realized if you don't allow slavery to expand, they would lose their power in the federal government. And the reality was that the structure of the federal government, as outlined in the original Constitution, favored slaveholders. From the Electoral College, this is why 9 of the first 16 presidents were slaveholders, to the Senate, where Southerners routinely held control over appointments, over presidential appointments. But as the population in the North began to explode in the 1840s and 1850s, largely because of both German and Irish immigration, and as Southerners looked at the growing population, excuse me? Okay. So is my wife's family. As you get more and more German and Irish immigration, particularly into northern cities, and as Southerners are looking at this map and realizing how much population is outpacing them in the north and what's going to happen to all these territories in the west, they realized if all of that land in the west, if all of that grayed out area, if that becomes free states where slavery is not allowed, they worried that eventually they would be outnumbered. And once that happened, it would mean that a free state majority could outlaw slavery everywhere. And again, to repeat, this brand new Republican Party was not an abolitionist party. Republicans were not arguing in favor of ending slavery immediately. They knew, unfortunately, that the Constitution protected slavery as property. There was nothing they could do about that. They were arguing against the expansion of slavery. Republicans talked about what they referred to as a, quote, cordon of freedom. If we surround the slave states, the existing slave states, with free states, eventually slavery will die out on its own. So when the possibility for Kansas to become free or slave, when that opened up, there was a violent battle over the future status of slavery in this territory. And again, ironically, there were almost no slaveholders living in Kansas, but when Kansas held its first territorial elections, and so these are elections that would decide the future of the territory and the future of the state, pro-slavery supporters from Missouri crossed over the border illegally. Well, you can cross the border legally, but they crossed over to vote illegally. And when free state supporters pointed this out, when residents of Kansas said, you don't live here, you can't vote, the pro-slavery supporters from Missouri used violence to effectively silence them. The result was that when Kansas held its first elections, the new government, which was in the settlement of Lecompton, Kansas, they drafted a constitution, and it was a pro-slavery constitution. Free state supporters were outraged. They knew that that constitution, that pro-slavery government, was fraudulent because it was influenced by all these voters from Missouri. So they held their own elections, which they won, and they formed their own anti-slavery government, and that was in Topeka. And Topeka drafted its own constitution, a free state constitution. So the whole idea of popular sovereignty was a complete failure, because given this opportunity to decide for themselves, you end up with two competing constitutions, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery. At the very same time all of that is happening, an abolitionist and a religious fanatic by the name of John Brown had come to Kansas. Now, Brown was part of a new brand of evangelical Christianity that had emerged during the revival movement known as the Second Great Awakening, which took place in the 1820s and 1830s. Sinners in the hands of an angry God, yes. And many of these, not all, but many of them, including Brown, believed that not only was slavery a sin, but as long as it existed, it was a stain upon the United States. But more important, these were millennialists, meaning they believed that eventually and imminently Christ would come again. And when he did, you would enter the kingdom of heaven, but that couldn't happen until you eliminated sin. Yes?
He attended the life of love to it. Okay? They were so moved by his death that he said his cousin will pay for it.
Lovejoy's a big part of it, of course. He's a follower of Garrison. And again, so what Brown and these other millennialists believe that They cannot enter the kingdom of heaven until Christ comes again. Christ will not come again until we eliminate sin. And so as long as slavery exists, I can't go to heaven. That's sort of what Brown believed. And this, of course, angered him. And he believed genuinely in in racial equality. He had black friends. He had been part of the free African-American community. He knew Frederick Douglass quite well. I mean, these are altruistic reasons as well. I mean, he believed these were the right things to do, but he also had these religious reasons. So this angered him. So after pro-slavery violence had taken place in Lawrence, Kansas, where pro-slavery forces had attacked free state supporters, Brown and several of his sons led a raid on a small community called Pottawatomie Creek. And in Pottawatomie Creek, they massacred several settlers they believed were pro-slavery sympathizers. In the middle of the night, they went to their homes, dragged them out of their beds, and literally chopped them into pieces using broadswords. Really brutal, awful things. A few months later, pro-slavery supporters retaliated. They attacked Brown's settlement, which was in Osawatomie, and one of Brown's sons died during that attack. Taken together, all of these events became known as Bleeding Kansas. And again, this demonstrates the complete and total failure of Douglass's principle, the thing that Douglass had staked his political career on: popular sovereignty. Given the option of choosing for themselves whether Kansas should become free or slave, this territory had descended into battle, bloodshed, and had produced two different constitutions. Both constitutions were sent to Congress, and effectively they said, Congress, you decide which of these will become the official territorial government. Around the country, virtually everybody was well aware that this pro-slavery constitution in Lecompton was fraudulent. Go ahead. 1856. Yeah. Everybody knew the pro-slavery constitution was fraudulent, but when the two constitutions were sent to Congress, President James Buchanan, lost him, there he is. President James Buchanan endorsed the Lecompton, the pro-slavery constitution, the fraudulent. That only made Northerners even angrier. Now, Douglass was a member of Buchanan's Democratic Party. He was furious. He openly broke rank with the president over this. At the end of 1856, Douglass marched into the White House to try and get the president to listen to reason. And they had a long argument. And really what was at stake here was the future of the Democratic Party, the home of Andrew Jackson. And as Buchanan told Douglass, he said, no, Mr. Douglas, Buchanan said, I desire you to remember that no Democrat ever yet differed from an administration of his own choice without being cursed. And really what Buchanan was sort of living in the world of the 1830s and 1840s. And Mr. President Douglas replied, I wish you to remember that General Jackson, Andrew Jackson, is dead, meaning that this isn't the world of the 1830s. This is a different world, and we have to adjust. There's one last piece of the puzzle, and then we'll actually talk about the debates themselves, and that is the very infamous Dred Scott case of 1857. Dred Scott was an enslaved man in Missouri. In the 1840s, his owner had taken Scott to the Free Territory of Wisconsin, although at the time it was actually what is modern-day Minnesota. In the Free Territory, Dred Scott met his wife, Harriet, and then after a few years, they were taken back to Missouri. But under Missouri law, there was precedent where enslaved people who had been taken from a slave territory to a free territory could sue for their freedom. These were called freedom suits, and there were hundreds of them, successful freedom suits, where enslaved men and women sued the local courts and gained their freedom. So Scott sued for his freedom. He sued in the circuit court, and if you are ever in downtown St. Louis at the old courthouse, there's a wonderful exhibit. The case made its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court had two questions to think about. First, was Dred Scott free? Did his status going from Missouri to Wisconsin, did that make him free? Second, was he allowed to sue? Did he have standing to sue? And in the majority opinion, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney said no. Scott, in fact, is not free because enslaved people were property. Property is protected by the Constitution, and therefore the federal government has no authority. It was unconstitutional, Taney said. It was unconstitutional to prevent slaveholders from taking their slaves into free territories, meaning that all of the territories were open to slavery, according to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Off to Canada. Tawney then also said, went a step further. He said, not only that, Dred Scott was not allowed to sue because he was not a citizen, because, he said, citizenship was reserved for white Americans only. No person, they said, no person, the Supreme Court said, of African descent, free or slave, was entitled to citizenship. Meaning not just slaves like Dred Scott, but they were saying that free African Americans living in the North were also not citizens. Now, this was obviously later overturned by the 14th Amendment, but it is widely regarded, the Dred Scott decision, widely regarded as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. To make matters worse, it became clear while the Supreme Court was deliberating that Buchanan went behind the scenes and he was personally lobbying the justices on the Supreme Court to come to a unanimous decision. He was lobbying and trying to influence the justices to decide in favor of slavery. And Buchanan's belief, the naive belief Buchanan had, was that if you had a unanimous decision, this would settle the slavery question once and for all. It would prevent future sectional conflict. Buchanan's from Pennsylvania. He was not a slaveholder. He's a Northerner. But because of his actions, both in supporting that pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution and his actions in this Dred Scott case, it looked like Buchanan's a puppet. He's a puppet of the slaveholders. What's that? He's a doughface, is what they would say. And this led to conspiracy theories, a slave power conspiracy, the idea that there was a conspiracy of slaveholders to control the federal government to force the rest of the United States to accept slavery. These conspiracy theories, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, all of this led to the growth of this new Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln's new political home. So thank you for bearing with me. Now we can talk about the debates themselves. Because in the aftermath of Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, the Lecompton Constitution, Douglas and Lincoln in 1858 face off over Douglas's Senate seat in Illinois. Now, Douglas had taken a stand against that Lecompton Constitution. He had publicly broken with the Buchanan administration, but he now faced a much harder challenge. He was facing re-election against this upstart, Lincoln. Lincoln, a young lawyer, 49 years old, from Springfield, Illinois, now a member of this brand new Republican Party. Douglas knew this would be a major political fight. Douglas had aspirations. He still coveted the presidential nomination in 1860, but he knew he also had maneuvering to do. He had come out against that Lecompton Constitution. He had taken a more anti-slavery stance. He had to find a way to appease Northerners without alienating Southerners. This is what had destroyed the Whig Party. It was impossible almost to please both North and South. Douglas didn't want to repudiate or come out against his own stance on Lecompton. That would be political suicide. But he also wanted to strengthen and unify the Democratic Party, which was growing increasingly fractured. So returning home that summer of 1858, beginning in early July, Douglas reaffirmed his dedication to the principle of popular sovereignty. Abraham Lincoln, age 49, also, as we've mentioned, enjoyed modest recognition outside Illinois, in contrast to Douglas again, who's the most famous political figure of the day. And again, in the midst of all this, most people assumed it was Douglas who would be the Democratic nominee in 1860. Very few people knew, outside of political junkies, who Abraham Lincoln was. But Lincoln had also evolved over the course of the 1850s. He had honed his skills as a lawyer. He had become one of the most skilled and respected lawyers in Illinois. But that Kansas-Nebraska Act had reawakened his political interests, and he had joined this brand new Republican Party. And then more arresting than his political resume was, of course, Lincoln's persona. 6'4" tall, of course, a gigantic height for his time. He was thin, but he was muscular. He had a craggy face. He looked like this gangly, popular leader. And this was an enormous contrast to Douglas, just 5'4", known as the Little Giant. Most dangerous of all for Douglas was Lincoln's mixture of moderation. He was not an abolitionist, pragmatism and political realism, and sincere conviction. Lincoln had long been a Whig, member of the Whig Party. His early political hero had been Henry Clay. But that Kansas-Nebraska Act had changed everything for Lincoln. He had always personally been morally opposed to slavery. Every piece of evidence we have tells us that. But Lincoln had always taken a safer course, didn't want to rock the boat. But that Kansas-Nebraska Act led Lincoln to directly confront Douglas. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind about campaigns and elections in the 19th century. Senators were not directly elected in the 19th century. This did not happen until the 17th Amendment in 1913. Today, we directly elect and popularly elect senators. But at this time, senators were nominated and elected by state legislatures. But in Illinois, several states, including Illinois, there was an election where voters could still express their view. It was more like a referendum. It was not binding, but it was essentially voters telling the legislature, here's who we prefer. So Lincoln and Douglas, even though the ultimate decision went up to the state legislature, they're appealing to the voters because the voters can advise the legislature. Yeah. Campaigns were also very, very different. As I mentioned at the outset, debates were not normal. In fact, candidates often didn't even campaign for themselves. Campaigning for yourself would appear to be as if you were seeking out office. That was unrepublican, meaning not capital R, but small r Republican. It was undemocratic to seek office. Elected officials were supposed to be called by the people. They were not supposed to seek political office or seek power, because power leads to corruption. So again, for all of these reasons, these debates were somewhat unprecedented. And Lincoln was the underdog. As the campaigning began in the summer of 1858, Lincoln began following Douglas around. Douglas would give a speech somewhere, Lincoln would follow him, give a speech about a day or two later in the same location, calling out Douglas for his views. This is what my teenage boys would call trolling. Lincoln was trolling Douglas, following around, kind of making fun of him. Finally, in late July, Lincoln went to Douglas, wrote to him, I should say, and proposed they should debate each other formally, and they should do it all across the state. Now, on the one hand, Douglas knew Lincoln was a formidable speaker and a formidable debater, but Douglas was also not one to back down from a challenge. Lincoln had initially suggested 9 debates. Douglas cut the list to 7. And they would have a staggered schedule, and it would appear again all over the state, all the way from towns on the Wisconsin border like Freeport down to the very southernmost counties in what was collectively known, still known as Little Egypt. And by the time these debates became public knowledge, by the time debates were set, public interest was immense. The first debate in Ottawa on August 21st, 1858, there was immense anticipation, again, because of the issues being argued, because this was unprecedented, because Douglas was so well known. And you had at every debate train loads. All of these towns are on the railroad. They're all rail towns. And they would have train loads of supporters. And they would arrive in banner-bedecked cars supporting their candidates, like a sporting event. They would show up with flags and bands and banners supporting Lincoln or supporting Douglas. Local farmers and shopkeepers would clog the roads. They would surround the debating grounds with their horses and their wagons and their buggies. Newspaper reporters attended and would take down virtually word for word what Lincoln and Douglas said. The New York Daily Tribune, for example, one of the largest and widely read papers of the day, printed verbatim transcripts. And you had reporters from Charleston, South Carolina, reporters from New Orleans, as well as all over the North, covering the events. And in the middle of all of this were these 2 men, both experienced debaters. One absurdly tall, leathery man whose stovepipe hat and ill-fitting coat made him look all the stranger, but who never lost his self-control. And the reporters were swept up in the spectacle, the show. And they described all 7 of these contests as packed with suspense and packed with revelation. But actually, if you were a political junkie and you followed things closely enough, the 2 men weren't really saying anything that was all that new. They were arguing about the most openly debated sectional questions, but they were often repeating their stump speeches. And this is where Lincoln's brilliance as a politician comes in, because he recognized, perhaps more so than Douglas, he recognized that these speeches are going out to a much broader audience. And he recognized that if he would talk to that audience, it would help him build his own political reputation. Douglas, as the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, had a lot of work to do to regain public confidence. And then along came that Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 had effectively said popular sovereignty doesn't work because you can't outlaw slavery in the territories. And Lincoln knew this. So during one of the very first debates in Freeport, Lincoln attacked Douglas directly and basically said, you have to choose. Choose the principle of popular sovereignty or choose to support the Supreme Court. Do you support the Supreme Court decision to Dred Scott as the law of the land? Because if you support that decision, you can't support popular sovereignty. And Douglas, as brilliant of a debater as he was, came up with a very crafty solution. Douglas's solution was slavery could still be prevented. No, you can't pass a law outlawing slavery from any territory, but you could pass laws that make slavery unfavorable. This became known as Douglas's Freeport Doctrine. And so, for example, this might mean, say, a territory or a state could discourage slavery by passing taxes. If you put large, high taxes on owning slaves, that will discourage people from moving there. And so Douglas said you can use local laws, enforcement mechanisms of the law to discourage slavery without actually outlawing it. It was actually a brilliant rhetorical argument. On the flip side, Lincoln was forced on the defensive. And this was particularly over the question of racial equality and the abolition of slavery. Douglas repeatedly accused Lincoln of being an abolitionist, of wanting to grant citizenship to African Americans. He race-baited Lincoln. He said Lincoln is an abolitionist, forcing Lincoln to effectively respond that he had no plan for the elimination of slavery. The peril for Lincoln was that Douglas could push Lincoln to endorse racial prejudices to the point that might actually alienate members of the Republican Party. So Lincoln found himself between a rock and a hard place. And let's remember that these are politicians. They are playing to their audience. If you read the full debates, and it's hundreds of pages, but if you read the full debates, you'll see that Lincoln says different things or emphasizes different things depending upon where he's speaking. So if he's down in Jonesboro in the southernmost portion of the state, he might say something a little bit different than he does when he's up in Freeport and Ottawa, which are the Republican strongholds. So as they traveled around the different parts of the state, Lincoln and Douglas would tailor their messages. And just like today, this is a zoom in of the Electoral College map of 1860. Just like today, Illinois was very divided between the northern and southern halves of the state. The parties are flipped. The southern half are Democrats, northern half are Republicans. But you can see as you go farther south, it gets darker blue. As you go farther north, it gets darker and darker red. Those are going to be very different audiences. And both Lincoln and Douglas were aware of that, and they would tailor their messages. So in some places, Lincoln sounded like an abolitionist. In other places, he very much did not. One of the most famous quotations from the Lincoln-Douglas debates came from the Charleston debate, which was the fourth, where Lincoln, in response to accusations that he was an abolitionist, that he would believe in racial equality, said things that do not sound like Abraham Lincoln. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together in terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. That sounds like white supremacy. It does not sound like Abraham Lincoln, at least the Lincoln we have in our popular imagination. And it's important to point out here that he's not talking about slavery. Nowhere here does he say he believes in slavery. What he said repeatedly throughout the debates is that he believed in the right and the ability of every person to earn what they work for, to earn the bread, to keep the bread that they earn. No person can take that away from an individual. But he was very clear in some places he didn't believe in racial equality. Now, this quote, which is the most extreme thing Lincoln said along these lines, is often taken out of context. And used to make arguments that Lincoln was a white supremacist. That's not true. And in fact, one of my favorite things about Lincoln, and one of the things I think makes him our greatest president, is his willingness to adapt and evolve and change. And so by the end of his life, the very last speech that he gives before he's assassinated, he says very clearly he believes in giving voting rights to black men. He had changed his mind over time. And nothing in this makes Lincoln very different than the vast majority of white Americans living in the 19th century. Something that is very hard, I think, for often my students and for 21st century Americans to understand is that it was possible to be both anti-slavery, as most Northerners were, and Lincoln definitely was, simultaneously be anti-slavery and anti-black, meaning you could believe slavery was wrong and still be, by our standards, an extreme racist. And that's, I think, a hard thing for us to wrap our minds around, because the assumption is if you were against slavery, you must be in favor of racial equality, and that simply wasn't the case. But again, in other parts of the state, depending upon where they were, Lincoln would offer responses that sounded much more progressive, sounded much more egalitarian. Alton, of course, was the final debate. By that time, both candidates were entirely exhausted. Douglas was exhausted near to the point of collapse. Douglas was also a very heavy drinker. He died eventually from complications to cirrhosis of the liver and alcoholism, and he was drinking heavily throughout these debates. And it's actually quite remarkable how adept he was at debating, given how much he was drinking. But by the time they get to October, 2 months effectively of debating and traveling around the state, and not just along with the debates, they're also giving stump speeches, 2, 3, 4 stump speeches every day. On October 13th, they had been in Quincy, the second to last debate. After that debate, they got aboard a steamship called the City of Louisiana, went down the river here to Alton, where the debate was scheduled for October 15th. Alton, again, is a major rail center, so the crowd was exceptionally large, boisterous, and loud, and it sort of culminated with the enthusiasm of all the debates over the previous 6 weeks. It's impossible to know for sure, but most estimates would suggest that the crowd probably was in the neighborhood of about 10,000 people. And they gathered in front of the old city hall, which is no longer there, but that's the location. So you have to imagine, instead of the grain silos there, behind that you would have the city hall. There was a large platform that was built, and the crowds gathered to hear the final of these 7 debates. At the Alton debate, Douglas continued to go after Lincoln on this question of slavery and abolition and racial equality. And Lincoln actually used that Alton debate to reconcile some of these seemingly contradictory positions he had been making. He continued to state very clearly he was not interested in racial equality, but he also said that Douglas was presenting a false choice. The choice was not racial equality or slavery. The choice, Lincoln said, is the choice is the eternal, quote, the eternal struggle between 2 principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the 2 principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of all humanity, and the other, the divine right of kings. It is the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that insists, you work and toil and earn bread, and I'll eat it. And so he made it very clear that even if he didn't believe in racial equality, there was still a very clear moral choice, and Douglas was on the wrong side. And with that, the debates were over. Lincoln narrowly lost. He lost the senatorial election. The geographical split, again, was very pronounced across the state. Democrats swept, as you can guess, virtually all of the southern counties. Republicans swept virtually all of the northern counties. Now, the districts in Illinois were drawn in the Democrats' favor. Gerrymandering is as old as the Republic. And the Democrats won 40 seats in the state house. They held 14 seats in the state Senate, while Republicans won 35 in the House and held 11 in the Senate. The upshot was that Douglas was reelected by a vote in the Senate, by a vote in the legislature of 54 to 46. But if you take the popular vote and you add up all the votes, Republicans actually had a majority, a very narrow majority of 50.6%. In other words, if this had been a popular election, a direct election of a senator, Lincoln would have won. And for this reason, he said he never lost an election to Douglas in his lifetime. Much more important, Lincoln, these debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, launched Lincoln onto the national political scene. It set the stage for Lincoln to gain the Republican nomination in 1860. The theatrics of the debates, the intense coverage they received, created this new political reality where candidates were repeating themselves, but they were also doing so thinking about other audiences. So they're not just talking to the audience that showed up in Alton. Lincoln's thinking about Republicans living in Michigan and Maine and Massachusetts and New York. This is effectively modern politics, speaking to your base. And Lincoln probably understood that better than Douglas, because he was giving speeches that when they were read in the newspapers, rather than just being heard by the local crowds in Illinois, they seemed to carry greater moral and logical weight. And almost overnight, these debates made Lincoln a household name. He received invitations from all over the country to speak. In late 1859, early 1860, he went on a barnstorming tour across the Northeast, which was a political stronghold for the Republicans. He gave a number of different speeches to continue to build support for his presidential candidacy. This was basically Lincoln introducing himself to a national audience, making his candidacy palatable for the power brokers of the Republican Party, and it worked. Because at the Republican National Convention in 1860, held in Chicago, Lincoln was selected as a sort of dark horse candidate. And it looked like there might be a rematch. We'd have a rematch of the 1858 Senate election between Lincoln and Douglas, but the Democratic Party didn't hold up their end of the bargain. At the Democratic National Convention in 1860, Southern Democrats stormed out when it looked like Douglas was the favorite. Southerners were unwilling to accept another Northern Democrat, Franklin Pierce in 1852 from New Hampshire, James Buchanan from Pennsylvania in 1856, and now Stephen Douglas from Illinois. Southerners wanted a Southern candidate who was explicitly pro-slavery, and that's something that Northern Democrats wouldn't support. So the Democratic Party splintered, just as the Whig Party had done 8 years earlier. Northern Democrats nominated Douglas, so on this map, that's the light blue in Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, across the Midwest. Southern Democrats formed their own party, the Southern Rights Democrats. They nominated a man named John C. Breckinridge. And in the border South, in the central states, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, you had a new party called the Constitutional Union Party, the shortest party platform in American history. There was one issue and one issue only. We support the Union, preserve the Union and the Constitution. Nothing else matters. The result was that Lincoln won a splintered election. He only received 40% of the popular vote. But when you add up, if you add up even all the electoral votes from all the other candidates, Lincoln still won easily. He had 180 electoral votes to a combined 123 of the other candidates. And in some ways, that validated the fears that Southerners had. Not a single Southerner had voted for Lincoln. But he still easily won because so much of the population centers were located in the North. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Cincinnati, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Louisville. Southerners looked at this political map, realizing they had not voted for Lincoln. Not a single Southerner had voted for Lincoln, yet he had easily won. They looked at this map and wondered, are they ever going to win another election again? With Lincoln's victory in hand, South Carolina immediately seceded just 4 weeks later, followed by 6 other Southern states. And before even taking office, Lincoln faced an unprecedented crisis, a crisis unlike any other that any president before or since has faced. Douglas, for his part, spent the last few months of his life, he would die in July of 1861, but he spent the secession crisis and the early months of Lincoln's administration supporting Lincoln. Douglas very famously said that there is but one party now, a party of patriots or a party of traitors. We belong to the party of patriots, meaning he wanted all Northerners, whether Republican or Democrat, to support the Union, and he supported Lincoln through the secession crisis. And finally, Lincoln took office. Inauguration Day was much later in the 19th century. It took place in March, so Lincoln didn't actually take office till March. Immediately after taking office, within a month or two, 4 more Southern states seceded, leading to the start of a 4-year bloody war that would kill 750,000 Americans and bring emancipation for 4 million more. But that's another story for another day. So, and I hope you'll forgive me. I went a little longer than I think I was supposed to, but I'm still happy to take questions. Yes. Yeah. So it's a good question. David Davis, who was, yeah, Judge Davis from Bloomington, who later becomes on the Supreme Court. He was sort of Lincoln's. Orville Browning was another. So Lincoln's political advisors. Honestly, offhand, I don't know who Douglas's confidants were, but it was. I mean, they were writing back and forth, but yeah, it was sort of brokered by the close political advisors. So Horace White was never really, at least at this point, was not really. Horace White was the editor of the Chicago Tribune, which was a staunch Republican paper, but he wasn't really a Lincoln man at this point. Though they certainly covered, they sent reporters to the debates and. Not a debate between the two of them. They certainly, I'm sure, traveled and spoke in Chicago, but Chicago wasn't one of the 7 debates. So, yep.
My understanding, I just worked already at National Trade Center one from and it's interesting to note that they were doing individual appearances, but there were multiple appearances in Chicago.
Mhm.
And so my understanding is that because Chicago knew them fairly well, that they chose to side based on congressional district.
Yeah, I think that's no, that's yes, that's correct.
I don't mind debating Lincoln. I don't mind debating Trump. But I'm damn I'm going to debate both of them at the same time. And the other equal because Lincoln would be say more nuanced and Jonesboro and it would be an odd one.
Right.
So Douglas used to take 2 things. And Lincoln's response was, if I had 2 faces, why would I walk around with this?
Good. To the Chicago question, so I think there were multiple speeches given in Chicago, and likely, I can't remember specifically, but I'm sure there were some given on the same day, and that's part of Lincoln following Douglas around. So it wasn't like formally part of the debates, but it was, again, sort of, as I said, Lincoln trolling Douglas by following around and speaking at the same time, sometimes the same day. Normally, it would be a day or 2 after Douglas had been somewhere, but other questions? That's a good question. No, I don't, not that I know of. I mean, I'm not sure he spoke directly about that. And he won the election, which was the most important thing. And he was still the odds-on favorite in 1860. I mean, Douglas was, as much as he was concerned about sort of arguing with Lincoln, I mean, he's really thinking big picture about the future of the Democratic Party, which is sort of splitting apart because of all of these issues that we talked about tonight. So he's constantly thinking about how can I sort of reunify, get the support of both Northerners and Southerners. It's a very delicate balancing act. And so I think he was more concerned with his own reputation and not alienating either side, so he would still have the chance at the nomination. So I'd hand over here.
All of the debates,
Mhm.
so there wasn't any other debates. Going on.
Not in this. I mean, this was very, very unprecedented to have. What's that? Very unique. And you certainly had active campaigns in other states, and you would have candidates. What's that? We're talking about the presidential election, sure. But even I mean, it was very common for candidates to give stump speeches. You would have often the sort of back and forth would play out in the newspapers. So rather than standing up together at a location and arguing with each other, you'd have, so-and-so said this, and then you'd have a shot back in the newspapers. And so candidates would argue with each other, but much more indirectly, certainly not in this kind of fashion.
At what point did political debate become like the norm? What was the trajectory?
Sure, and it's a great question. And unfortunately, as a historian, I died in 1865, so I don't know much after that. Sometime in the 20th century, I mean, that's what I was going to say. Kennedy Nixon is sort of the watershed moment in my mind. And part of that is, of course, the advent of television as a medium. So But even, I don't know of debating even being common in the late 19th century among candidates. Yeah, I would say so, yeah. Yes,
Very,
yes, yep.
how influential was any of these debates or later on?
So I wouldn't say for the debate specifically, but in terms of mobilizing election and voters, they're very influential. And there's a fellow who works, written a number of books named John Grinspan. He works for the Smithsonian. He wrote a really good article about the wide awakes. And the wide awakes are one thing I didn't talk about in the talk, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but it's also important to remember the 19th century is very different politically in terms of how parties were organized. We are so accustomed today to thinking of political parties as large national organizations, and that just wasn't how they functioned. You had a wide range of parties. So, for example, in the period between, say, 1830 and 1890, there are more than 100 different party affiliations in Congress during that stretch. And when you get down to the state level, you get all these strange party names. And so the Wide Awakes are a great example of this and how political mobilization worked. And it largely worked on the ground. And so as a kind of proto-militia organization, the Wide Awakes were really good at, and really important in terms of getting sort of younger voters, younger Republicans, mobilizing them, getting them out to vote for Lincoln in 1858, but really in 1860.
Book, but I just see on C-SPAN break.
Mhm. He's a good historian.
And yeah, it seemed to me that, and I guess where I'm going at is, I know they were involved with Salem during the Marshall Street riot,
Mhm.
okay? John, line, to save the line, okay? Those guns that were taken out of that armor removed the whole, why one? And then put on ready, they sent the spring 60,000 guns, okay? With the Wide Awake behind, did they help move those guns? That's a lot of guns. That's the large parcel left.
This is in 1860.
86, when Jefferson Davis sent his command and something,
Yeah.
to play with Jackson, the scene's going down.
This is happening, I mean, and this is this is happening. So during the secession crisis, you have this moment where both arsenals, post offices, and customs offices, that Southerners are immediately trying to seize these places, both for the guns, but also for the money. And there's outrage across the North. If you read the newspapers in 1860 and 61, Northerners are outraged that this is happening because this was federal property. It was communal property. It was the property shared by everybody. And so I couldn't speak to whether the Wide Awakes were responsible for it or not, but I know there was a large movement in the North sort of against this and trying to prevent. Yes, sure.
Yeah. That wall supposedly represents the foundation of the Civil Hall.
Yeah.
And when I first did Promo back in '94, C-SPAN sponsored the debate reenact. And of course, we all remember 1993, flood was all underwater. So the C-SPAN group, Brian Land came in like a year before, we were kind of beat the local community, saying, you guys are now responsible for things that are reenacted. And Sound Fathers, we met with I was but the waters had just receded, and there was the old parking lot covered with mud. And Brian Lynn looked around, and Sound Fathers at the time said, now you come back here now, we're going to have this beautiful plaza with like some statues and lighting and money poles and trees and shrubberies. And Brian Lynn, after the debate concluded, we had a little reception of the Stratford, and Brian Lynn said, after a cocktail, he said, go quote me, I left all going, those people have lost their mind. There's no way. They're that town to get together and get the project done in time. for the reenactment, and also set up at the top. All my fault.
Good. Yeah, congratulations.
We also have Frank House. And two of Stephen Douglas's executives were there. Stephen Douglas was born, and his cousin, Robert.
Yeah, I got.
Oh, and I'll tell you what, they were kind of short, stock.
You don't say.
When Douglas died, wife and Bill, brother South Carolina,
Mhm.
she went back to South Carolina. So these guys came in, had that southern drawl, the charm, the bark off the tree. They had to go through the Charlotte airport, it's Charlotte Douglas Airport.
No, it's all interesting. All right. Thank you.